I've published a lot of books. A lot of them are collections of essays written by other people. One of the things that I've wanted to do, one of the things I've done, is to really provide the possibility for people to publish. I've really included scholars, younger scholars, their first publications in one of these edited books. I've included scholars from various countries, specifically Brazil, the Caribbean, Africa, different places, where there's sometimes difficulty of making the work of these scholars in these other countries that are known in the Anglo world. I've consciously made sure that I published as many women scholars as I could. Worked with as many as I could in terms of editing. Been very, very conscious of those principles of actually now what we call EDI for a long time. And so that's one batch of publishing. The first one I did was actually published through the African Studies program at the University of Wisconsin, not really a publisher. And it was in honor of my supervisor and mentor, Philip Curtin. And I got a bunch of his students together, and we wrote essays, and we published it in that way. That was really my first venture in editing. And then I went on from there, and I just edited lots and lots of books. I was a series editor for Sage Publications for a while. Published a number of books and with Westview Press as well. And I think I published some significant books in those early series. But the big series that I've been involved in is the Africa World Press series, which is the Harriet Tubman series on the African diaspora. I've now published in that series more than 40 books. Some of them actually edited or co-edited by me, but most of them, of course, by other people. So that's one aspect of my publishing is working in this sort of international collaborative mentoring format. Many of the people that I've published have gone on and have distinguished careers. So I'd like to think that I helped in terms of providing the ability to get their work known, particularly in the Anglo world, where in Brazil and the Hispanic and the Francophone world, it's often difficult to crack through that barrier. Much more difficult than it is the other way around, because really English is the dominant language in terms of scholarship. Uh, so then in terms of my other books, my first one was really a revision of my PhD thesis by, I would say by standards of today, it didn't really take that exceptionally long to publish it, but at the time it seemed like it took a long time to publish that, my first book. It didn't appear until 7 years after my PhD, which seemed to me quite significant. There were reasons for that that related to the fact that not many publishers published very much in African history at that time, and my book was at the time really out of step with what was being published in African history. African history was basically focused on political history, pre-colonial political history, and reconstructing historical narrative of states and societies. And my first book was quite different. It was really about it was economic history. It was a history of a trade route across West Africa, which was seemed a little bit idiosyncratic at the time. Now it wouldn't faze anybody, and far more bizarre things have been published than that, and are being published. In fact, the diversity now is enormous, so there's not even an issue. But at the time there was, it was necessary for me to come up with two publishers, one on each side of the Atlantic. And it just took forever to negotiate back and forth and back and forth. And then in the end, it turned out that I was teaching in Nigeria at Ahmadu Bello University. I took a 2-year leave of absence from York so that I could teach at Ahmadu Bello University and develop actually an economic history course in the department there. And while I was there, the university, which was relatively new at the time, quite new, decided it was going to have a university press, and so it founded a university press and worked out an alliance with Oxford University Press to do a joint publication. So this was all going. So I decided that what I really wanted to do was to make my book accessible in Nigeria, and this would make sure that it would be. It was actually published in Nigeria. So I was actually, I think, the third book in the history series that they started. My book, it came out in 1980, and it was it was a little bit strange considering that I went on to publish so much more, because at the time my friends and colleagues in the history department here made a real joke out of the whole thing about my book, because no one ever saw my book, and I had to come up for tenure and promotion on the basis of a book that no one had ever seen. And one of my good best friends, Christopher Armstrong, who's now passed away, he just made so much fun out of all this. he insisted it wasn't published by Amadou Bello University, but Bello Loudly University Press. And so we always had called it Bello Loudly University. That was the big joke in the department. And so, as a result of that, the obscurity of its publication in Nigeria from a certain type of perspective. Um, um, my next three books I published with Cambridge. So that sort of flipped things, since Cambridge is really with Harvard and so on, is really the top publisher. Yeah. And so I think I was I was the first person, I was the first person to publish 3 books with Cambridge. Well, the first one was a book called Transformations in Slavery, which since has gone into two revisions, slight revisions, and has been translated into French and Italian and Portuguese and Spanish. So it's a history of slavery in Africa. It was first published in 1983. Um, I had a year off. Um, I was supposed to write a book on salt, but instead I wrote this book, and that book came about because in the 1970s, when my career really started, both in graduate school and then when I was teaching at York, um, there was a big debate going on within what was a rapidly emerging and developing field of study, which was African history. And there were really two, and the developments in particular related to the subject of slavery. The whole field and interest in the study of the forced migration of Africans um, during the period of economic development of a European-dominated world became a big, major subject, which it is today, of course, which it should be. It's a major historical phenomenon that happened. So there was we knew each other. Everybody knew everybody back then because the numbers of people were much fewer. But what emerged in the 1970s was basically 2 schools of thought about the subject of slavery and how to approach it. One was very strongly Marxist influenced and was very heavily Francophone, um, with which I was very closely allied, and indeed still am. And another very dominant approach, which was more anthropological, which was very much Anglophone in terms of those scholars who advanced its major features. And it really, the issues really hung down over if the same terminology that we use in describing what happened in Jamaica as slavery could be used, that same terminology could be used in Africa, which to me in hindsight now seems rather silly, because of course it can, and it is, and we do, and that book, Transformation in Slavery, was one of was a major factor in shifting the discipline in terms of its approach, because it really, what I set out to do, what seemed curious to me, was while this debate was developing between, well, is slave, is it defined as, this is when someone is reduced to being property, which is my definition. It's also Karl Marx's definition of what a slavery is that slave is form of property. And it's a property relationship. While the anthropological approach says, no, there are various degrees of belonging to a society. And these people are on the fringes of the society. And they're in the process of being absorbed and assimilated into the society, which, if you look at slavery as property, and that means it also involves violence. So slaves are like property. Anyway, the more I looked, the more I collected, the more I saw, as I saw that slavery was everywhere in Africa, in every single society, and the earliest documentation for any society included references to slavery. It doesn't tell us how far back in history slavery goes, because it goes back as far as documentation goes, and you can't do anything more than speculate beyond that. But what I ended up really doing was pulling together lots and lots of references to primary sources, to anthropological studies, to government, without really doing much archival research, except in my own specific narrower areas of African history, which were Nigeria focused. I've done a lot more since, but the outcome of all of that was to pull a book together, which I call Transformations in Slavery, in which I demonstrated that slavery was a common institution everywhere, that there were more slaves in the 19th century than there were in the 18th century. That, and I ended the book really sort of with the beginning of colonial rule, asking the question, so what happens under colonial rule? So that was a book. And it's been a book that's very influential, because at the time, there was this big debate, a really silly debate, about a very important political debate about, did Africans enslave Africans? Did they enslave themselves? And was this Africans versus Africans business? And so therefore, to come out and actually show that the slavery thing really had nothing to do with race, and it had a lot to do with something that was common to virtually all parts of human society, including European societies. So that I think that was that hit the field at a time when it just put an end to any sort of discussion about, whether terms were applicable or not, and this, that, and the other, which had been the debate. And it was very, very clear that there are dimensions to the anthropological approach to slavery that were interesting questions, and therefore was very influential. But it was also very, very clear that the more Marxist-oriented approach was dominant. It was just, you know, if you can if you can show that a society has its own definitions of slavery, and that those definitions absolutely match what are the definitions in English and French and so on, then it's the same bloody thing. I mean, how can you conclude anything else and say, oh, no, no, this is different, this is different? A slave is a slave. And since that debate influenced the development of African history, um, the study of slavery in the Americas has expanded enormously, and the complexities of slavery in the Americas has become uh, just it, it's just recognized. Slavery was a simple institution. It was very complex, very flexible, um, and we have to be very, very conscious of terminology, because it's very easy to adopt the terminology of of the dominant slave-owning society in doing the discussion, rather than trying to take the perspective of the people that were actually the victims. Um, and so so that was an influence. But I did allude to the fact that when I did write the Transformations in Slavery, which came out of I gave an initial long paper at a conference at the University of Waterloo in about 1979. Um, um, Michael Creighton, who's a very noted Jamaican historian who's at the University of Waterloo, held a conference with quite a pioneering conference. And and I presented an initial paper, which just basically was the outline of the book Transformations in Slavery. It was a long paper which just showed that everywhere you looked and everything you touched, you found slavery. And that you could see certain types of changes over time in terms of the intensity, its location, and the reasons for and what was happening. So I put that out on the table. And and at the time, um, a close colleague and to this day a very close friend, Professor Martin Klein at the University of Toronto. Um, he was another one who was involved in this debate within the discipline, and was on the same side as the Marxists. And we were close friends, and I suggested to him that we write a book on slavery in Africa. And he thought that was a good idea. He liked my paper. He was right on. Um, but to be honest, it didn't work out. I was ready to write. I had done a lot of collecting of materials and stuff that are in these boxes in this house that are being digitized. Um, and I was ready to go and start writing, and I thought this is a hot topic. I don't want to. And he had other projects and this, that, and the other. And I said, okay, Martin, I'll do it alone. So I did it alone, and we've done some work together, and we've always been friends, and we always interact, and our work is very complementary to each other. But I ended up writing that book alone, and but I was supposed to write. Um, what I had a fellowship to do was to write a book on salt, not on slavery. So that was a moral dilemma for me for a couple of years, believe it or not. More I felt guilty because I was doing one thing when I was supposed to be doing another. Actually, I ended up doing both. Looks pretty silly now to me in retrospect. Um, but I was, I, since my first book was on cola, which had been my PhD thesis, I had discovered in that research that one of the major commodities that was traded for cola was salt. And so I thought, and I got a grant, that was just, getting the grant was the basis of my guilt, um, um, was was to look at the history of the salt side of the trade, because then I had looked at the cola side of the trade. And the salt side was very complex because the salt came from um, uh, the middle of the Sahara Desert. It came from the eastern shores of Lake Chad. It came from evaporating basins of water after the rainy season in the Sahara edge, where after the water evaporated, they're left with, well, before the water completely evaporates, what you have is a brine, because you have very quite heavy concentration of salt in it. So different types of origins, different types of salts, different types of uses of the salts, um, different commercial patterns. So that's what I was studying, and that became my book, Salt of the Desert Sun. Um, and um, for me it was an interesting book because it had a really chemistry dimension to it. Uh, Initially I was quite naive. I went out and I collected samples of all the different types of salt. I still have all those samples. I thought I was going to get them all analyzed and all and do this, that, and the other thing with them and everything, which was really naive because, of course, all the analysis of all those salts have long been done. The first thing the colonial powers did when they took over this area is they analyzed every piece of mineral they could find. Yeah. So all you had to do was find their reports, and you had extremely accurate details of exactly what was in the different types of salts, and they were in Hausa, and in that market, in that language, in that culture, there are 21 different types of salt. So it's not like just table salt. Table salt there is, but it's rare because sodium chloride is a rare salt. Um, until it's discovered that it's not rare. Uh, there's a whole history of salt. I had no idea when I started doing this project. There's even an international society called Historians of Salt. Can you believe it or not? And the study of salt in China and Europe, and oh my Lord, it's a big industry. The study in and of itself. The first sodium chloride was in significant quantities was first discovered by the Chinese a couple of thousand years ago. They discovered that if you, in certain places, and if you put a hole down in the earth deep enough, and you could find salt, and you could pump water down into that hole and bring up salt water, and you could get as much as you wanted. And then various processes in Germany and in England did all kinds of things. It was the basis of the development of the whole industry related anything to do with chemistry. Was everything goes back to salt, and the attempt to get enough salt to feed people became a big industry, and finding brine springs and then tapping them to their maximum, then finding salt deposits under the earth, uh, which was uh, which was a chance discovery when they were actually searching for coal. At the time, there was no recognition that there was a direct link between the existence of coal and salt, which had to do with the formation of the earth. And not only that, as the Chinese had discovered, is that virtually everywhere under the earth, there's lots of salt. So that salt isn't really rare, which is what was originally thought, is something that's common and very common. I mean, in Ontario, there are salt mines under Lake Huron, for example. In Kansas, there are big salt mines because that's so salt is not a problem anymore, but it was at the time. And then, so what in the area that I was looking at, they were there were sulfates as well as chlorides. They were carbonates, and there were potassium as well as sodium. There were all different types of salt. So the first thing I had to learn, which went back to my undergraduate days, was that salt is not just salt. And in fact, there are so many different types of salt that really in modern chemistry, the term has no meaning. It doesn't, you don't talk about, you don't talk, in real chemistry, you don't talk about salt. It, that's much too simplistic. Uh, there are so many different types of salt. It's really a chemical interaction and formulation more than anything. So and sulfates were being used in the dyeing of textiles, and they were being used in the curing of animal hide and turning them into leather. And so they had an industrial use. Um, some of the carbonate salts were, uh, a number of the salts were used in cooking, of course, and the recipes and the names for food varied with the type of salt that you put in it. That could change, and that would affect exactly what the taste would be like, depending upon the extent to which it was a sodium chloride or as a carbonate. And and then the carbonates were also used extensively as medicine, as stomach medicine, just as they are in modern society today. Those are salts that you take to if your stomach is upset. And then also certain types of salt were mixed with tobacco and taken either as chewing tobacco or as snuff, because in Muslim society, smoking was, for religious reasons, was prohibited, but it didn't mean you couldn't take tobacco as snuff or chew it, and both were done extensively, and they were mixed with one of the salts to give it an extra um, boost, an extra taste, an extra kick. Uh, and men often carried a little pouch around their necks or their waist that was filled with a mixture of the salt and the tobacco. So they had snuff or chewing tobacco ready whenever they wanted it. Um, so that was that book, um, and and in the course of all of this, because I now had looked at slavery more carefully, uh, and because of the nature of labor relations in looking at how salt was produced, convinced me that slavery was really a very important topic. And in the case of salt, um, in some cases, slavery was important, but in other cases, it was really migrant farmers who, in the dry season, when they after the harvest, um, gradually the lakes and the ponds along the desert edge dry up, and as they dry up, the farmers have finished the harvest for their crops, and they move to temporary camps next to the lakes uh, to some extent because they can do some irrigated farming because there's still water in the lakes, and they can do irrigation and grow some stuff. But also because the lakes dry up completely, and in the course of drying up, it becomes more and more concentrated in terms of the salt that it has is left in the water, which obviously doesn't evaporate and doesn't go anywhere. And then they create little ovens along the edge of these drying up lakes and boil the brine down into cones, the pottery cones, um, which they break the cones, and they have a lump of salt, and and so then that's easy to transport. You know, but that's migrant labor. It's not slave labor, and yeah, and so but on the other hand, the oases in the desert um, at Bilma and at Fashi and at Tigada in Temset, which were very important sources of the purest salt in terms of sodium chloride, and therefore is a luxury uh, for cooking, um, and more expensive and so on. The work that was performed in extracting the salt at these desert oases was done by slaves. Uh, so you had slave labor, you had free labor, and then you even had a concentration of brine springs in the Benue River Valley at about a half a dozen locations, places like Awe and Kiana, close to the Benue River, just to the north of it, um, where there were brine springs. And here it was women's work. You know, women did all the work. And what they did is the brine spring, the brine came out. There was a system of ownership of areas that you could work, um, and women had access to those different places where they could access the brine. Then they would boil it down until they had salt, and that salt too was also very, very pure in sodium chloride. Um, on the other hand, it was also limited because there was only so much um, spring water that could be produced during the course of a year, which of course the British came along and measured it, and it's all calculated right down to before anybody looked at the scientific results. They made all kinds of wild projections about how much salt could be produced. Never some real naive scholarship, not realizing that you can't produce more salt than can be produced by the brine spring. And that is something that is scientific and can be measured over a period of several years, and you will see that it doesn't vary too much in terms of how much brine you're going to get. So then there it was again boiling the brine down into cones, And then it was distributed over, well, a reasonably significant area, but it wasn't that much salt, so it couldn't be that much of an area. So, but it was all different types of labor. But I really, when I started working in Nigeria, when I was teaching there, and I worked with Jan Hogendorn, who's an economist. We both did a lot of interviewing at the time on the subject of slavery. And that was the basis of what became our book, A Slow Death for Slavery, which is the course of abolition in northern Nigeria from 1897 to 1936. And slavery was not finally fully abolished in northern Nigeria until 1936. That's remember, the British abolished slavery in their colonies in 1834. So this is 100 years later. So, and the title "Slow Death for Slavery" comes from a quotation from one of the colonial officials who described the British policy towards ending slavery in his colony as a process of slow death. That it would only take 1-2 generations, you know. That was the aim. Extremely conservative. So that was working with Hogendorn on that book was refreshing. We hired undergraduate students, and we taught them how to use cassette tape recorders, and we taught them how to do interviewing and what to ask and how to do it, and then told them to go to their home areas and ask questions, which they did. Collected a lot of information on slavery, you know. And in the meantime, Hogendorn and I were both teaching at Ahmadu Bello University. And the university is only 45 miles, what's that, 60 kilometers away from the archives, which are in Kaduna. So we would often go down and work in the archives, or we go to different villages individually with one of the students, or a couple of our assistants became absolutely indispensable, amazing individuals. Amadou Machito and Yusufu Yunusa. Amadou Machito in Zaria worked with us, and then he was so good, and then we realized we got even different types of interviews if he went alone, because once he knew what we were doing, and he was smart. He actually went on in his own career and became principal of a secondary school. You know, so he was nobody who was stupid. Quite the opposite. He's quite knowledgeable and very interested in the subject and so on, and was excellent. So he recorded. And Yusufu Yunusa, it was parallel. He was in Kano, not in Zaria. Machito was in Zaria, and Yusufu Yunusa was in Kano, who went on in his career to publish in Hausa 4 or 5 books. He also became principal of a secondary school in Kano, and both of them, of course, were historians in effect. And um, um, but there were other students. There were several that went on and became university lecturers in history.